16, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and to continue the deliberation here that makes this the most deliberative body anywhere in the world. And I understand that the Senate might take issue with that. However, I'm always happy to engage in debate with the senators as well. I came to the floor because I wanted to speak, Mr. Speaker, about an issue that has cost scores and scores of American lives. And since the time I came into this Congress, I was surprised, you might say shocked and appalled, that so few members were paying attention to the reality of what's happening in the streets of America and over the years. And I think of a school bus that was run off the road up in Cottonwood, Minnesota a few years ago, and 4 of the children in that school bus were killed. 2 of them were siblings, and 3 families were hit with that terrible tragedy. And the cause of that accident was a vehicle that ran the bus off the road that was driven by an illegal alien that had been interdicted multiple times, turned loose on the streets to recommit again and again. And I recall that discussion, and it brought home to me something that I knew logically, but I hadn't felt it emotionally at that point, Mr. Speaker, and that is that if there are people in this country who are unlawfully present, and the law directs that when encountered by law enforcement that they shall be placed into removal proceedings, if we enforce the law, and if we enforce the law when we encounter people that are illegally in America, then by the very definition of following the law that requires that they're placed in removal proceedings, they're no longer on the streets of America. They're no longer driving vehicles that are running school buses off the road or bringing about head-on crashes or being involved in vehicular homicide or driving while under the influence, because by definition of enforcement of the law, they're not here to do that. They might commit these crimes in other countries, in their home country. That's the issue for the countries that they can be lawfully present in. But here, when I see the funerals of 4 children that come about because we had an opportunity to enforce the law, and instead we decided that our compassion for the lawbreaker was greater than our compassion for the victim of the crime, you end up with 4 funerals of children that were riding home from school in a school bus that day. Now, it shouldn't take very much for people who are professionals that deal with this every day to understand that if the law says that they shall be placed in removal proceedings, you have a president who says to them instead, through Jay Johnson, is now Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, to the law enforcement officers who pledged and take an oath to support and defend the Constitution, which, by the way, the President takes an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And the very definition in the Take Care Clause of the Constitution is that he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, instead, the President has decided to essentially execute some of the immigration law that exists. That doesn't mean enforce it. When I say that facetiously, Mr. Speaker. He says he has ordered the law enforcement officers to not enforce the law. And the advice that came from Jay Johnson to the law enforcement officers, Border Patrol, if you came into this job and put on this uniform and took your oath to support and defend the Constitution, and you thought that it meant that you're going to enforce immigration law, if you think that's what you're going to do, you'd better get another job. That was the message to them that came out here about 10 days ago. Get another job if you came here to enforce the law. If you're working for the Border Patrol or for ICE or for Custom Border Protection, it's an appalling thing, Mr. Speaker, to think that we have a president who has taken an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and instead he's taking care that they not be enforced in case after case after case. And this poster I have, Mr. Speaker, is the bloody result. The headline says on here, the title, "People Freed to Kill." 124 criminal aliens released by the Obama policies charged with homicide since 2010. Now, that's not all the homicides. Here's where they are. A lot of them in California, a good number of them in Arizona, Texas, up along the East Coast, Council Bluffs, Iowa, or in Omaha, and yes, in my neighborhood as well, Mr. Speaker. Now, that's 124 killers. These are criminals that had already been prosecuted, already been convicted. These are felons that have been released on the streets of America because of a policy that the president seems to think is a discretionary policy. And it's not 124 graves only. It's at least 135 graves because of the multiple murders that have taken place after they're convicted, and at least 2 of them that were released on the streets in the past were already convicted of homicide-related charges. That's how bad this is. The idea that we shouldn't enforce our laws even against people that are illegal in the United States, unlawfully present in America, out of some sense of compassion, and they might say that they don't have the room and they don't have the budget. Well, that's not so either. I would just note some of the statistics that I have pulled down here over time. In 2012, ICE reported that there were 850,000 aliens present in the country who had been ordered removed or excluded, but who had not departed. 850,000. Now, they tell us that there's 11.2 million illegal aliens in America. Well, I don't actually accept that number. That's a number that's been constantly and commonly used here. I arrived here in 2003. I swore in here on this floor in January of 2003. At that time, the immigration debate was talking about 12 million illegals in America. 12 million, 12 million. The drum of 12 million was beat for several years. Then it drifted down to 11.5, now 11.2 million. We're thinking that we have a crisis with illegal immigration coming into America, but the number hasn't increased. Have that many gone back home? Have that many died? If not, that number is growing, and I think it's grown substantially more. But the data we're looking at is 11.2 million, and that's from the Pew Research Center. I think they do a good job. I do disagree with them on that number. But if that's the case, out of 11.2 million illegals in America, 850,000 aliens are present in the United States of America who had already been ordered removed, and we call that law enforcement. Just about anybody in the world that's ever looked across and thought about coming to America knows that your chances of being sent back to your home country, if you succeed in getting into America, are nil. They're almost nothing. And if you embarrass the administration, if you're such a violent criminal, perhaps they'll find a way to send you back. But even this administration, when they want to send them back, the few that they do, they don't push hard on those other countries to take them back. Every country in the world that refuses to take their illegals back, we have the leverage to convince them, I believe, to take those illegal aliens back. 850,000 of them. So I didn't divide that out, but it's roughly 1 in 12 of the illegal aliens in America have already been adjudicated for deportation, but they don't go, and we don't do anything about it. Here's another statistic: for every 10 Americans detained in federal court, 173, that's Americans, 173 illegal aliens are detained by a federal court. So I don't know why they gave me 10 of 173, but I can divide that out in my head. Federal court deals with 17.3 illegal aliens for each American. That would be an American lawful permanent resident or an American citizen that they deal with. That's a high volume of illegal aliens going through our federal court system. Here's another piece of data that emerged from a study that I requested in 2005. And this was a GAO study that shows that 27% of our federal prison population are criminal aliens. 27%. So more than a fourth of the inmates that are housed in federal penitentiaries are criminal aliens. Now that is a huge percentage. And if you would think that they're in there for immigration crimes, for overstaying their visa or for crossing the border, no, that's highly unlikely that they're incarcerated for what this administration would call minimal offenses. They're in there for other things. But here's another example of this: the illegal aliens, a group that represents. The illegal aliens represent 5% of the population, 27% of the federal prison population, and presumably 27% of the. And so that's a proportion of more than 5 times their representation in the population. They're represented in prison. They're represented by the crimes that are committed. Now, we should not think that these are just data, Mr. Speaker. Crimes aren't just data, because for every crime, there's at least one victim. And the victims pay a huge, huge price that's not compensated by the taxpayer. For example, our criminal laws are descended from Old English common law. And Old English common law recognized this, that everything was the product, the property of the sovereign, the king. And if you went out and poached a deer, the crime was against the crown, because the king owned the deer. The king owned everything. So if you poached a deer, you killed the king's deer, and the king's going to have his justice. If you killed one of his subjects, one of his serfs, if you committed murder, the crime was against the crown. That's why today the crimes that we have are against the state, the nation state, or whether it be the state that we happen to be abiding in. And so when you go to criminal court, they'll say this is a case of the state versus whoever has the charges brought against them, and John Doe criminal. And you'll hear that announced at the beginning of the criminal case. This is a case of the state of, say, Iowa against John Doe criminal. And the victim, if the victim is alive and survives and is in that criminal courtroom, they're going to be looking back and forth, listening to the prosecution and then the defense go back and forth, and they're going to be wondering, where am I in this equation? The victim is not in the equation, because if the state believes that they get justice, then justice is served, and the victim is essentially out of that equation, with the exception of a few little things we've done, such as to allow for and provide that the accused has an opportunity, the crime victim's family has an opportunity to face the accused and actually face the convicted. And so we're descendants from that, Mr. Speaker. And the crimes are committed against individuals. The victims of these crimes are paying the price. They're paying the price with their lives. They're paying the price with their bodies. They're paying the price with whatever their treasured products might be. If they're a victim of assault and battery and grand larceny, then they've been beaten up, they've been pounded, they've been bruised and bloodied, and maybe bones broken. Maybe they've survived an attempted homicide, and maybe their wallet was lifted in their credit cards or their car. The things that they owned, the things that they cherished, are lost. And they have to heal up, and we don't compensate them for their loss, even though the state is an intervener in a criminal crime. So the case of the state versus John Doe criminal should tell us that the loss of life is not compensated either. It's not measured. It's not quantified. The 124 criminal aliens released who committed murders during this period of time is a small portion of the overall number of criminal aliens who were released who did commit homicides. But what are those lives worth? We just heard the gentleman from Minnesota lament the loss of 2 lives. It's tragic. I'm sorry he comes here to this floor. I'm sorry that he feels that pain, and I'm sure the families feel the pain. But these are mostly anonymous victims. The 4 children in Cottonwood, Minnesota. Kate Steinle, the story that I pulled here, her name is now a household name, Mr. Speaker, was murdered in San Francisco July 1st, 2015. And now, when I see an attractive young lady with brown hair, and immediately the picture of Kate Steinle flashes into my mind's eye, standing there innocently and was shot and killed by a criminal alien who'd been ordered deported. I believe the number would be at least twice before on the streets, because San Francisco is a sanctuary city. Well, the sanctuary city isn't just exclusive to San Francisco. It's all over this country. There are sanctuary jurisdictions. There are sanctuary jurisdictions in Iowa, at least 25 of them that I can identify, and they exist across the country. Local jurisdictions that have decided they are not going to cooperate with federal law enforcement officers. And furthermore, when ICE puts out a detainer order, federal law requires that an ICE detainer order is mandatory. The statute that was passed directed the rules to be written in such a way that the detainer orders are mandatory. On February 25th of a year ago, February 25th, I believe that date would be. I remember my date is right, not certain on my year. It could have been the 14th, 2014, rather than 2000. But the ICE temporary director, Dan Ragsdale, sent a letter out to hundreds of political jurisdictions, law enforcement jurisdictions, and said to them, this ICE detainer order that you've been getting, that you've been complying with because it is an order, it's really not an order, it's just a suggestion. So we're not going to enforce that, and we're not either are we going to protect you if you are sued for detaining someone that ICE has put a detainer order on. They essentially said, we don't have your back at the Justice Department, even though the law directs that we do have. And so that brought about more sanctuary cities, more sanctuary jurisdictions, entire counties that have decided they're not going to cooperate with ICE. So when ICE sends an ICE detainer order to a sanctuary jurisdiction, often a city, their policy is, we aren't going to turn this criminal over to ICE. We're going to turn them loose instead. Well, when they turn them loose instead, they do so by the tens of thousands. And you know, Mr. Speaker, that Americans are the victims of homicide as a result. Some of it first-degree murder, second-degree murder, negligent homicide, vehicular homicide. Americans' graves are scattered all over this country at the hands of illegal aliens, criminal aliens. Not only those that came across the border illegally, that makes them criminals, Mr. Speaker, but those who are in this country even legally, when they commit a crime, they become a criminal alien. There's graves in every single state in this country, multiple graves in every single state in this country that didn't need to be. There are grieving families all over this country in every single state that didn't need to grieve. They didn't need to see their loved one killed, whether it was a car accident, whether it was a bullet, whether they were bludgeoned, however it might have been. Those lives could have been saved by enforcing the law. But instead, the Obama administration does the opposite. They set up an affirmative plan to start turning loose illegal aliens who are felons, who are criminals. Here's some more data. And in 2014, according to a U.S. Sentencing Commission report, it shows illegal immigrants represented 36.7% of federal sentences. 36.7% of their sentences, and I've already said that 27% of the inmates are criminal aliens. And then, again, it's about roughly half or a little bit more of them are from Mexico. The Obama administration in 2013 released, and this number has been committed to my memory for some time, 36,007 criminal aliens turned loose on the streets. And that represented 88,000 convictions, more than 88,000 convictions among those 36,007 criminal aliens. And of that, 193 had been convicted of homicide. Now, when do you turn murderers loose on the streets of America? Especially if they are deportable. If they serve their time, they might be second-degree murder, maybe they serve their time, maybe they get an early out, they go home to their home country. They're deported at the end of their sentence. That's how our law reads. But the Obama administration said, no, we're going to turn 36,007 of them loose. 193,000 homicides represented by them, 426 sexual assaults, 303 kidnappings, 1,075 aggravated assaults, all of that packaged up in the 36,007. And that was just 2013. That was the beginning of this mass release of criminals who are criminal aliens, deportable criminal aliens out of our prisons. 2014, they slacked off a little bit. They only released 30,558 criminal aliens, and they represented 79,059 convictions. That's the work that is being done by the Obama administration. And I could go on with data after data. Here's one. ICE had been claiming to have removed record numbers of unlawful or otherwise removable aliens from the United States. Well, they counted their deportations differently than any. So those that said, I'll accept a voluntary return when they're caught at the border, they'll say, well, we can send you, we can put you in the van and haul you back to the port of entry and turn you loose to walk back across the bridge. If you'll do that, we'll count you as a deported. That used to be just voluntary return. Now the Obama administration has admitted that they have essentially jiggered the numbers and changed the category. But even still, even if this isn't accurate in comparison to previous administrations, those numbers have gone down. From along the way, 389,834 fiscal year 2009. It did go up a little bit the next year, 392,000 and change. Then down to 396, or up to 396, excuse me, and then going back. But the number in 2012 was 400 and almost 10,000. So you can see, Mr. Speaker, that number has dropped off by tens of thousands. And then ICE has since admitted to dropping in removals clear down to 368,000 in 2013, 315,000 in 2014. This number continues to go down, from up in 410,000 down to 315,000, almost 100,000 fewer deportations when they're counting the voluntary returns in that list. That means we don't have a lot of immigration enforcement going on, and the message in the signal is, come try to get into America. We're not going to talk about that in this Obama administration. And what happens? Well, what happens is we have a presidential nomination process that has emerged. And out of it comes what? Who got the first big bounce and spark off of making the pledge that he would build a wall, a beautiful wall, and he would return the people and end illegal immigration residents in America and put them the other side of the wall? That was Donald Trump. If Donald Trump doesn't have that issue, Donald Trump doesn't probably have a campaign. I'm sure that it's a big part of what motivated him to run for president. Ted Cruz also, Mr. Speaker, has the solidest and the cleanest record on the immigration policy. It's complete, it's inclusive, it's anti-amnesty all the way. And by the way, he doesn't make provisions for inviting people back in after they are removed. I don't think that takes a lot of prudence to hold that position. Why would you reward somebody that you needed to go to the trouble to adjudicate them for removal, deport them back to their home country, and then do as they said in the Gang of Eight bill? They have a provision in that bill that thankfully the House didn't take up. It's the "we really didn't mean it" clause, in which they say, written into the Gang of Eight's bill, if you have been deported in the past and you're in your home country today, after the Gang of Eight bill would presumably pass, you can apply to come to the United States. We deported you before, but we really didn't mean it. We can bring you back in here if we hadn't caught you in America and you'd been in America while Gang of Eight bill would potentially become law. Then if you'd get to stay under those provisions, then you get to come back to America if you've previously been deported. I think that's lunacy, Mr. Speaker, to be going to all the trouble to enforce the law and then to reverse course with that and provide the, well, let's say, the "we really didn't mean it" clause. And that bill, by the way, had in it prospective amnesty. In other words, it didn't deal with people that would come in after it became law, so presumably they would be treated with the same kind of amnesty or pass that those that were in America. And those that had been deported from America, they get to come back to America too, with some exceptions if you're a bad enough criminal. The logic of this is beyond my ability to reason with it, Mr. Speaker. But the logic that this country needs to reason with is the logic of the rule of law. We have to be a nation of laws, not of men, and the laws need to apply to everyone equally, not apply differently to different people. And there has to be an expectation that the law will be enforced. And if we don't have that, then we devolve into a third world country where you end up having to, a third world country, you can get pulled over for not speeding, but you might have to pay off the officer in order to be able to drive on down the road. In this country, if that ever happens, I wouldn't say that it never happens, but where I come from, it does not happen, and I never hear of it. That would show a digression away from the rule of law. We have to all respect the law. The law's got to be enforced against everybody equally. There has to be an expectation that the law will be enforced. And any country that has any value to protecting its own sovereignty has to have borders. We have borders. We know what they are. 2,000 miles on the southern border, roughly 4,000 miles on the northern border, oceans on the east and on the west. That's the borders of the United States of America, water all the way around Hawaii. We know the lines in Alaska. We don't dispute them with Canada. We get along just fine agreeing on what our borders are. But if we don't enforce them, if we don't protect them, we're no longer a sovereign nation. When we allow people to come across the border and stream across the border, we've had Border Patrol testimony here in this Congress where they testified that they believe that they interdicted perhaps 25% of those that attempted to cross the border. And when you looked at the numbers of those interdictions and you did the math on that, it turned out to be 4 million illegal border crossing attempts in a year, in a single year. Now, that's roughly at the peak of this. That's diminished down, I think, some by a few million. But think of that. 365 divided into 4 million works out to about 11,000 a night. About 11,000 illegal aliens coming across our southern border at night. Maybe that number could be as far down as perhaps 6,000 or so. But that's still the size of Santa Anna's army. The size of Santa Anna's army coming across our southern border every night, and coming across with that, sure, there are some decent people that are looking for a better life, maybe a lot of them. But 80 to 90% of the illegal drugs that are consumed in America come from or through Mexico. It is the demand of the United States that brings those drugs in here. We have a culpability in this too. But just the same, the violence in Mexico, the murders that are there are over 100,000 people have been killed in the drug wars in Mexico. It's all part of an open border situation that we have here in the United States, costing Mexican lives, costing American lives, graves scattered in every single state in the Union, because we have an administration that decided not to enforce the law, even though the President takes an oath to preserve, protect, defend the Constitution, and take care that the laws be faithfully executed. We've got executive overreach time after time after time. He's reached into the constitutional authority of this Congress. And time after time, I brought an amendment to this floor, Mr. Speaker, that has cut off all funding to implement or enforce the President's lawless, unconstitutional amnesty actions, to cut off all funding to the Morton memos, to cut off all funding to DACA, to cut off funding to DAPA, and shut down those operations that are outside the constitutional authority of the President, by my definition, by the definition of the majority vote in this Congress, and also by the definition of the President himself, who said multiple times, and we have him on videotape at least 22 times, saying he didn't have the authority, he didn't have the constitutional authority to, I'll put it in shorthand, grant amnesty. He didn't use those words, but it certainly is the paraphrase of what he had to say. And after multiple times of telling us all that is proper constitutional interpretation, he decided to do it anyway. The President of the United States restraint factor is not giving his word, putting his hand on the Bible, and raising his right hand and taking an oath to the Constitution. His restraining factor is not his word, it's what he can get away with. He demanded that Congress pass the Gang of Eight amnesty bill, and Congress said, nuts, we're not doing that. We're not going to see the demographics of America forever altered by bringing in millions of undocumented Democrats in order to play into the hands of Barack Obama and the Democrats in the Senate and the Democrats in the House. We have a responsibility to the American people. We, the people, need to decide. That's why our founding fathers wrote in the Constitution, in the enumerated powers, the responsibility of Congress to establish the naturalization laws and, by inference, to write the immigration laws. That immigration policy is not to be set by the President of the United States. It's to be set by Congress. Congress wrote the laws. The 1996 Immigration Reform Act, which Lamar Smith of Texas was so instrumental in, is a large body of the immigration law that we have to follow. That was the considered will of the people. It was a bipartisan considered will of the people, signed by the President of the United States. Gee, that'd be Bill Clinton back then, wouldn't it? And so we have that is the unchallenged greatest nation in the world. We have a lot to be proud of. We have a destiny, an arc of history that has been flattened. It's been descending for a lot of reasons. Economic reasons, foreign policy reasons, cultural reasons, failure to adhere to our oaths to uphold the constitutional reasons, but in a large way diminished because we have so little respect for of all of the things we can talk about with immigration policy, securing our borders, ending sanctuary cities, making sure that local law enforcement works again in cooperation with federal immigration officials, ending this idea that out of ICE that detainer orders are voluntary, not mandatory, piece after piece of this, an entry-exit system that tracks the people in the country and when they leave, so we know what the balance is of those visitors that are here. And an E-Verify system that I will say the New IDEA Act, King's Bill, all of that put together brings America the right place. We have an obligation to turn this into an ascending arc of history, not descending. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your attention, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman